What did the religious and humanist existentialists contribute?
The religious existentialists reconciled Sartrean ideas of freedom with the Judaic-Christian tradition. The humanist existentialists brought the more abstract aspects of existentialism into literature or developed them in different directions philosophically.
What was the relevance of Plato's laws to Plotinus and Gallienus?
In the Laws, c. 360 BCE, Plato describes a stable system of government that is less utopian than the Republic. c. 380 BCE, because it allows for private families and private property. Some commentators have claimed that Roman Emperor Gallienus was not interested in a Platonic form of government, but that he liked Plotinus and agreed to the plan for a community as a favor to him. Plotinus, it was said, was mainly interested in setting up a retreat for himself and his followers.
What was Auguste Comte's positivism?
Comte advocated the use of mathematics for making decisions in ways that still influence statistics and business models today. He believed that our knowledge all comes from observation and asserted that it was impossible to know anything about physical objects that could not be observed. The goal of science was prediction, said Comte, and explanation has the same structure as prediction. He meant by this that a theory that generates predictions about what will happen can also explain what has happened. For example, suppose our theory is that friction, oxygen, and combustible material will cause fire. From this we can predict that striking a match will result in a flame. And we can also explain why striking the match causes the flame. Comte also thought that imagination should always be kept in check by observation.
What were the shared goals of the St. Louis Hegelians?
Although Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831, was chosen as the guide for the group by Henry C. Brockmeyer, 1826–1906, their interests were not so much in theoretical abstractions as in understanding their own life and times, particularly the U.S. Civil War. According to Denton Jacques Snyder, 1841–1925, their goals were to philosophize practical life, to be able to give a rational account of their vocations, and achieve self-realization. They also wanted to contribute to the future greatness of society. Philosophy for them was closer to a religious practice than an academic one.
What was some of the Catholic response to Martin Luther's dogmatism?
The Catholic response was to question whether Luther really had any knowledge at all and to emphasize the importance of Christian faith. Gentian Hervet published a 1569 edition of Sixtus Hypotoses, specifically as a cure for dogmatism, which would lead to serene confidence in the Church's doctrine of Jesus. Portuguese philosopher and physician Francisco Sanchez, c. 1551–1623, developed Pyrrhonic skepticism as a criticism of Aristotelianism in Quod Nihil Sitter, 1576. Although in his arguments for nominalism, combined with empirical observation, that led him to conclude that knowledge itself could not be obtained, Sanchez was closer to academic than Pyrrhonic skepticism.
What was Martin Heidegger's theory of space?
Dasein creates space by assigning proximity or distance to objects in the world with which it is concerned. And the space that results from existence in this way does not necessarily line up with abstract dimensions and distances. The eyeglasses on a person's nose, for example, are farther away to the wearer than the picture hanging on the wall that he or she looks through the glasses to see. Objects in space acquire a characteristic of being ready to hand. They are things that we use and manipulate. The ready to hand, although literally in space, has its real meaning through human action over time. For example, if you pick up a hammer, you intend to do something with it in the next few minutes. And you are doing that to achieve a goal after that, such as hanging a picture on the wall.
What did Friedrich Hegel think was the highest form of spirit?
The modern state of Hegel's own time is considered by him to be the epitome of absolute spirit. This state is a unity that molds its members and also allows them individual freedom.
Who were the Cambridge Neoplatonists?
The founder of the group was understood to be Benjamin Whichcote, 1609–1683. Whichcote called reason the candle of the Lord. Henry Moore, 1614–1687, Ralph Cudworth, 1617–1688, and John Smith, 1616–1652, were three further distinguished Cambridge Platonists. Cudworth was the father of John Locke's lifelong friend and lady of the household in which he spent his last years, Damaris Cudworth. Additional Cambridge Platonists of note were Nathaniel Culverwell, 1619–1651, Peter Sterry, 1613–1672, George Rust, d. 1670, John Worthington, 1618–1671, and Simon Patrick, 1626–1707. Whichcote, Moore, Cudworth, and Smith were associated with Emmanuel College. Calvinism was the leading doctrine there and they all rebelled against it. Henry More was the most intellectually active member of the group.
What is philosophy for children?
Philosophy for children is an attempt both to introduce critical thinking and the subject of philosophy to high school students and to explore and develop natural interest in philosophical questions among younger children. In Europe, high school age students have traditionally had at least some philosophy on their curricula. The question in the United States is not whether teenagers are capable of learning philosophy, but how to introduce it and find teachers qualified to do so, as well as funding. While psychologist Jean Piaget set the paradigm that children are not able to think about thinking or engage in philosophy before about age 12, philosopher Gareth Matthews, 1929, argues in Philosophy and the Young Child, 1980, that there was evidence of philosophical thought and speech in Piaget's own young subjects. Before then, Matthew Lipman, 1922, had introduced philosophy to middle school children in Montclair, New Jersey, with his 96-page philosophical novel for children, Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery, 1974. A philosophical novel for children is a story that raises philosophical issues in language that a child can understand. Both Matthews and Lipman have stressed the active nature of children's philosophical interests. By contrast, Norwegian author Jostein Gaarder's best-selling young adult novel Sophie's World, a novel about the history of philosophy, 1994, leads the reader through a series of studies about philosophy. Thus, philosophy for teenagers may be more didactic than the philosophy already taught to children. Contemporary journals devoted to teaching children philosophy include Analytic Teaching, the Community of Inquiry Journal, Critical and Creative Thinking, the Australasian Journal of Philosophy for Children. Questions, Philosophy for Young People, and Thinking, the Journal of Philosophy for Children.
What was Gottlob Frege's main innovation in the philosophy of logic?
Frege treated predicates as functions and subjects as arguments. Thus Socrates is mortal becomes function mortal is applied to argument Socrates. In his conceptual notation, 1879, Frege also introduced a simple way to treat words and terms such as all and there is as logical quantifiers. Logical quantification is a notational system that connects a variable with what is being talked about. For example, in the sentence every person alive today will die someday. Person alive today is being talked about and every is the quantifier. This treatment of Frege still stands today.
What did St. Anselm of Canterbury begin?
St. Anselm, 1033–1109, known as Anselm of Canterbury, was a Benedictine monk and the second Norman Archbishop of Canterbury. He is famous for his ontological proof for the existence of God in proslogion, and for his model of satisfaction in the atonement in his Cur Deus Homo. Anselm's ontological argument to prove God's existence amounts to this. Imagine a being that is the greatest being that can be imagined. Such a being exists in the intellect alone. If this greatest being were to exist only in the intellect, a greater one that existed in reality could be imagined. But there cannot exist in reality a greater being than the greatest being that can be imagined. Therefore, that imagined being is the greatest being. Now, this greatest being would be everything and have every attribute that it is better to have than not to have. Living, wise, powerful, true, just, blessed. Unchangeable, non-physical, eternal, beautiful, harmonious, sweet, and so forth. That is, and this is the crux of the ontological argument, because being is better than non-being. God will have being, which is to say, he will exist. Anselm goes on to claim that God, as the greatest being that can be imagined, is simple. Everything that exists is better insofar as it more resembles the Creator of all things, namely, God. All created beings, which are created by God, owe their being and well-being to God. But God is independent and has no obligations to his creations.
What were Aquinas' views on science?
As an Aristotelian, Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, believed that every object has its proper place. He also held the Eudoxian astronomical view that Earth was in the center of 49 to 53 concentric spheres. However, he thought that scientific conclusions required judgment and assessment, so that all findings and reports should be considered and compared. He also believed that scientific information could be changed and revised, which is a strong tenet of modern empiricism.
Who were the encyclopedists?
They were scholars who attempted to systematically present all of human knowledge at their time. Chief among them were Boethius, 480 c. 525, of Italy, whose work went far beyond the alphabetized speculations of the other two who best represented this period, St. Isidore of Seville, 560–636, and the Venerable Bede of Britain, 674–735. Both Isidore and the Bede were clerics who devoted their lives to ecclesiastical service. Isidore compiled Etymologia, or Origins, which was a systematic presentation of all available learning during his time and endured as a textbook in church schools for hundreds of years. The Venerable Bede was best known for his histories, particularly that of Britain. The next real philosophical luminary was Johannes Scotus Eriugena, c. 815 to 877.
Did Mikhail Bakunin get along with Karl Marx?
Bakunin and Marx were bitter enemies. Marx campaigned to expel Bakunin from the International Working Men's Association. The tempestuous relationship between Marx and Bakunin is a well-known part of the history of Western socialism. As a co-member of the International Working Men's Association, Marx referred to Bakunin as a man devoid of all theoretical knowledge. Bakunin said that Marx was from head to foot an authoritarian. The instinct of liberty is lacking in him. Although Marx said that Bakunin was in his element as an intriguer, it was Marx who in 1848 published an untrue rumor, begun by the Russian ambassador, that Bakunin was a Russian agent responsible for the arrest of Poles.
What is Aristophanes' comedy The Clouds and how does it relate to Socrates?
Aristophanes' comedy The Clouds, 423b. CE, is considered a satire of Socrates and other intellectuals of the day. In the story, Strepsiades is an Athenian who has been plunged into debt by his spoiled, extravagant son, Pheidippides. Socrates appears, suspended in air, and asks Strepsiades to remove his clothes before entering his thinkery. Socrates proceeds to relate his discoveries, which include the distance a flea can jump and determining if a gnat is whistling or farting. He insists that a vortex, and not Zeus, is the cause of rain. The play continues with absurdities such as Socrates stealing from a nearby wrestling school to feed his students, and insults to the audience in the course of a debate about new and old logic. At the end, Strepsiades' son, who has been schooled in the thinkery, tells Strepsiades that it would be morally right for him to beat both his father and his mother. The outraged Strepsiades sets the thinkery on fire and viciously beats up Socrates and his students. Some believed that the clouds contributed to the slander against Socrates that led to his trial and death sentence. But Socrates is said to have appeared on stage after the first performance and waved to the audience. And in Plato's Symposium, Socrates and Aristophanes are depicted drinking together and conversing in friendship.
How did Ptolemy's view of the solar system become the accepted theory?
Ptolemy of Alexandria, 90 to 168 c. Using observations and existing written work between 127 and 151 CE. codified the common sense of his time that the sun and planets revolved around Earth. His work overthrew the more revolutionary writings of Aristarchus of Samos. c. 310 to 230 BCE, who in On the Sizes and Distances of the Sun and Moon claimed that the Sun is much larger than Earth based on his observations of our Moon. According to Archimedes of Syracuse, 287 to 212 BCE, who combined mathematics with observations to found the science of mechanics. Aristarchus said that the fixed stars and the Sun remain unmoved, that the Earth revolves around the Sun on the circumference of a circle, the Sun lying at the center of the orbit. Aristarchus correctly surmised that to explain the apparent immobility of the fixed stars and assuming Earth did move, the distances between the stars would have to be huge compared to the diameter of Earth's orbit. Aristarchus' theory was defended by Seleucus of Babylonia in the 2nd century BCE. But the consensus of educated opinion was that Earth was the center of the universe, either as a floating ball that the heavens revolved around, or a stable solid, which was how it appeared to humanity. Hipparchus of Nicaea, c. 190–c. 120 BCE, in Bithynia, around 130 BCE, put forth a theory based on the work of Eudoxus of Cnidos. c. 409–350 BCE. According to Eudoxus and Hipparchus, the apparent movement of the Sun, Moon and planets was the result of their presence in crystal spheres that were concentric in relation to Earth. It was this view that Ptolemy used as a basis for his mathematical calculations.
What are the highlights of Alfred North Whitehead's career?
Whitehead spent the first 25 years of his teaching career at Trinity College, Cambridge. Whitehead and Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, distanced themselves from each other after. Russell became a pacifist during World War I and Whitehead's son was killed in that war. Whitehead taught at the University of London and began publishing works on philosophy of science, such as Principles of Natural Knowledge, 1919, The Concept of Nature, 1920, and The Principle of Relativity, 1922. His most important work as a process philosopher was Process and Reality, 1927–1928. Which was published after he moved to the United States to accept a position at Harvard.
What did Thrasymachus think about the concept of justice?
Thrasymachus of Bithynia, FL 427 BCE, is known mainly as a character in Plato's Republic, whom Socrates trounces in preliminary attempts to define justice. Thrasymachus asserted that justice is no more than what benefits those in power, and that it is therefore of no use to those who are ruled by them. In real life, Thrasymachus is believed to have traveled and taught throughout Greece, besides being famous in Athens. In a speech he wrote for a member of the assembly, He advocated for Greek unity and efficiency in government.
What did Thomas Reid believe about free will?
Reid believed that we are able to will something because we have a conception of the action and we will to do that thing. Concerning freedom, Reid thought it was not sufficient, as David Hume, 1711–1776, had claimed, that we act according to our will, but that we must also have the power to choose what to will. This is because willing is instrumental to the goal of an action. And without the power over means there is no power over the end. Your free actions are those caused by you and you know that you are their cause. Because your conviction of your freedom arises from your faculties, as a first principle.
Who was Max Weber?
Max Weber, 1864–1920, held chairs at the universities at Freiburg, Heidelberg, and Munich. Although what biographers refer to as a nervous ailment curtailed his career as an academic, his main project was to understand the dominant features of modern life in its Western development. His most famous work was The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, 1904.
What is the big problem with Hume's reduction of the self to perceptions?
Overall, Hume saw the mind as a kind of theater stage, across which ideas pass. With each idea a separate existence of sense or logical relation. He did not address the implied question of whom the audience is that has access to this theater. What he was looking for and failed to find was an object of reflection that could in a unitary, distinct way, justify the term self. He was not looking for the reflector, or the I in search of itself. He simply assumed that this reflector was not the self he was looking for when one enters most intimately into what I call myself. Another way of putting this is that Hume's analysis of the self cannot account for that process of analysis, of reflecting on one's own ideas. Hume did not take into account the fact that he was reflecting, and that the thing he was that was reflecting is what is meant by the word self.
What were the main ideas of the pre-Socratics?
Thales, c. 624 c. 545 BCE, Anaximander, c. 610–545 BCE, and Anaximenes, c. 580–500 BCE, who were all from the city of Miletus, thought that the natural world was made up of one kind of material, such as water, the unbounded, or air. The unbounded probably meant something like what we mean by something that is infinite. Pythagoras thought that everything was made up of number. This did not mean that everything was based on mathematics, as we might think, but rather that numbers themselves were real things that existed in everything else that existed. Heraclitus, c. 540 to 480 BCE, noted that the world and things in it are constantly in flux. And he claimed that change was more important than what the world was made up of. Parmenides, c. 515 to 450 BCE, on the other hand, thought that change requires that things come into existence from non-being. And for that reason he believed that change was not possible or real. Heraclitus and other Milesians held that the real stuff or substance that makes up the world cannot change. So that to account for change there has to be a number of substances making up the world. Empedocles, c. 495 to 435 BCE, built on this idea to posit the four elements, earth, wind, water, and fire. Anaxagoras, c. 500 to 428 BCE, thought there were more than four basic elements, perhaps as many as an infinite number. Democritus, c. 460 to 371 BCE, posited that everything is made up of atoms.
Who was Queen Christina and why was she important in Descartes' life?
René Descartes' second royal correspondent and student, Queen Christina, 1626-1689, of Sweden, was a less conventional figure than his other pupil, Princess Elizabeth. Although her philosophical skills and subsequent historical legacy were not as great, Christina's father raised her as a prince. And when she assumed the crown she took the title of King Christina. During her reign she greatly expanded the number of noble titles and extravagantly spent down the treasury. Most notably for New Sweden, a colonization of America in an area near Willington, Delaware. Christina abdicated in 1664, changing her name to Maria Christina Alexandra. She did this to convert to Catholicism, which was then illegal in Sweden. Maria Christina went first to Rome and then France. She enjoyed great attention as a former queen and was an active patroness of science and the arts. She was remembered for her shocking male dress, a short skirt, stockings, and high heels, which allowed for greater freedom of movement than the long skirts women wore at the time. Greta Garbo portrayed Queen Christina in a 1933 film that was highly acclaimed critically but did not do well at the box office.
What was David Hume's great ambition in philosophy?
Hume sought to create a science of the mind, using empiricist methods in the same way that Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, had created a science of the physical world.
Did John Rawls believe in complete equality?
No, Rawls, 1921 to 2002, was not an advocate of total distributive justice or the ideal that all members of society should receive equal amounts of everything. But he applied the standard of fairness to inequalities through his difference principle. Inequalities must be of the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society.
What is experimental philosophy?
It is a very new philosophical approach that aims to use empirical information to back up the ordinary intuitions to which philosophers refer. People are given philosophical problems or solutions to them and asked if they agree with the philosopher's answer. Experimental philosophy has been applied to philosophy of language, philosophy of action, and intuitions that free will is not compatible with determinism.
Who were the St. Louis Hegelians?
They were a group of philosophers and teachers who founded the St. Louis Philosophical Society in 1866 and began to publish the Journal of Speculative Philosophy in 1867. The founding members were Henry C. Brockmeyer, 1826 to 1906, William T. Harris, 1835 to 1909, and Denton Jacques Snyder, 1841 to 1925. Brockmeyer was a Prussian immigrant who had come to the United States in 1844, attended Brown University, plied several trades, and lived in a hut, like Henry David Thoreau 1817 to 1862. Harris was a Yale dropout who came to St. Louis to teach Pitman shorthand. Brockmeyer and Harris undertook the project of translating Hegel's Science of Logic, 1812, into English. Snyder, who had graduated from Oberlin College, came to St. Louis in 1865 to teach at Christian Brothers College. How did the St.
He was educated at Yale, preached and knew. How did the Enlightenment affect the United States?
America did not develop its own philosophical tradition until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the period before the American Revolution and the founding of the new republic, the excitement of liberty from oppressive government, the dignity of the individual, and rights to private property were all highly motivating ideas. These optimistic ideas were inspirational in the writings of Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and others. The American separation of church from state, as an article of individual liberty against oppressive government religion, and for free thought and speech came directly from Enlightenment ideas. as did the division of the powers of government and the distrust of government. It should be noted, however, that libertinism and outright atheism were to remain European phenomena for a very long time. Under the inspiration of Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758, American Protestant religious philosophy flourished. In the late 18th century, in a New England born-again movement known as the Great Awakening, York City, and became a leader of the Great Awakening in 1729 in Massachusetts. His theology was a Puritan form of Calvinism. Edwards' interest in philosophy included Nicholas Malebranche (1638 to 1715), the Cambridge Platonists, and John Locke (1632 to 1704). He was himself an idealist, similar to George Berkeley, 1685 to 1783. Who held that human minds are made up of thoughts and sensations, God being the only true substance.
What are the roots of St. Anselm's ontological argument?
First, St. Anselm's, 1033 to 1109, argument for God's existence seems to depend on pure reason as means to truth, which goes back to the ancient Greeks. That it only depends on reason, without observation or experience, perhaps makes it closer to Plato, or the Neoplatonists, than to Aristotle. Second, the argument relies on the ancient assumption that being or having more being is better or more perfect than non-being or having less being.
What was Ralph Barton Perry's realism?
Perry wrote The New Realism, Cooperative Studies in Philosophy, 1912, with 5 others, Edwin B. Holt, Walter T. Marvin, William Pepperell Montague, Walter Boughton Pitkin, and Edward Gleason Spalding. They were in revolt against both idealism and dualism, holding that what we perceive and remember are what they appear to be, as we are conscious of them. Their conclusions were similar to those of G. E. Moore's, 1873 to 1958, Common Sense Attack on Idealism.
How were John Stuart Mill's views on women influential?
Mill expressed these views at a time when it was fashionable for educated men to sentimentalize the traditional role of women. Such sentimentalization, for example, can be seen in social thinker and critic John Ruskin's Sesame and Lilies, or English writer and critic Coventry Patmore's poem The Angel in the House. Many religious authorities and political leaders were outraged and shocked by Mill's opinions on this matter. On the other hand, the suffragist movement had already begun in both England and the United States, and the support of a famous philosopher and public figure was perceived to be a great help in the cause. Nonetheless, it wasn't until about 50 years after the subjection of women. 1869, was published that women got the vote in both countries. Although the rights Mill advocated for women are now largely taken for granted. Some feminists believe that Mill's failure to address the issue of the division of labor within the family rendered his arguments for the liberation of women incomplete, as did his basic assumption that, even once liberated, the vast majority of women would still choose to be wives and mothers. And although Mill stressed the personal development of women, he did so more within the context of their traditional roles than in terms of their autonomy as human beings.
How did Edmund Husserl separate mathematics and logic from psychology?
First, Husserl distinguished between numbers that are the result of counting actual objects before us and numbers as symbols. Clearly, most of mathematics deals with numbers as symbols. Husserl claimed that symbolic numbers, as well as propositions and universals, cannot be reduced to mental states, as psychologism claimed, as intentional objects of consciousness, in Franz Brentano's 1837–1917, sense of intentionality. These logical and mathematical entities are objective.
What was medieval philosophy?
Medieval philosophy was the historical period of thought from the 4th through the 14th centuries, which was dominated by religious concerns, the study of ancient Greek philosophy, and a need to reconcile rational inquiry with religious faith. It was mainly, but not completely, limited to the implications of Christian doctrine. Thus, Saint Augustine, 354–430, in the 4th century gave Christianity its first philosophical foundation in politics and ethics. And at the end of the era Nicholas of Orsma, 1323–1382. In working out Aristotelian theories of motion that were approved by the Church, he was able to anticipate infinitesimal calculus and coordinate geometry, before Galileo's mechanical theories.
What makes the concerns of these historically disadvantaged groups part of philosophy?
When philosophers take up these concerns, as many have in recent decades, they become part of the official curriculum of philosophy in higher education. In addition, the issues raised require the methods of both analytic and continental philosophy to resolve. Some of these issues are ethical and others are directly related to political philosophy and public policy, both of which are now part of the canon of contemporary philosophy.
How did John Searle disagree with Alan Matheson Turing?
The American philosopher John Searle, 1932, a professor at the University of California at Berkeley since 1959, has described his own work as an attempt to reconcile the world of science with the human self-conception of mindful animals with free will. In his Intentionality, an essay on the philosophy of mind, 1983, Searle argued that mental states are both caused by and realized in neurobiological brain processes. He called this view biological naturalism. In his Chinese room argument, he attempted to refute a broad Turing-inspired strong artificial intelligence view that mind could be duplicated by the right computational device. Additional works by Searle, which advocate the non-reductionality of consciousness, while also acknowledging contemporary science, are Expression and Meaning, Studies in the Theory of Speech Acts, 1979. The Rediscovery of the Mind, 1992, The Mystery of Consciousness, 1997, and Mind, A Brief Introduction, 2004.
What did John Locke mean by saying the mind was a tabula rasa?
Unlike the rationalists, who thought that we were born with certain ideas about the world, Locke thought that our minds are like a blank slate, tabula rasa, at birth. All of our ideas are the result of two different processes that happen after we are born. The first is sensory experience, and the second is our reflection on our sensory experience and on the workings of our own minds. One of his main arguments against innate ideas was that people do not all have the same ideas, but their ideas differ as their experience has differed.
How did Pyrrhonic skepticism get its name?
It was named after Pyrrho of Elis, 360 to 270 B. CE, who thought that knowledge was impossible.
How did Islam contribute to Christian European philosophy?
Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked cooperatively in the Spanish libraries, established by Muslims, that were important centers of learning, as well as locations for book collections. The greatest achievement was the rediscovery and translation of ancient Greek texts done first by Islamic scholars. Aristotle was resurrected and became the fulcrum of scholastic educational activity. During the same time, both Islamic and Jewish thinkers became known to European philosophers, who respected them highly.
Who was Pierre-Simon Laplace's most famous student?
The man who would later become the most famous French dictator in history. Napoleon Bonaparte, was one of Laplace's students. Laplace's definitive analytic theory of probabilities, 1812, was, in fact, dedicated to Napoleon.
Who was Friedrich Hegel?
For sheer intellectual firepower, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831. Was probably the most brilliant thinker of the 19th century. He was a philosopher who could think about the entire world with an Aristotelian comprehensiveness, if not an Aristotelian lucidity.
What is consequentialism?
Consequentialism is the 20th century version of 19th century utilitarianism. The utilitarian moral system held that we should act so that the greatest pleasure or happiness for the greatest number results, with everyone counting for one and no one counting for more than one. G. E. Moores. 1873–1958, ideal utilitarianism specified that the goods we should seek as the result of our actions are aesthetic experiences and relations of friendship. Consequentialism is a more general form of utilitarianism that holds that we should act so as to bring about the best consequences, or act to maximize the results. Contemporary consequentialists often speak of preference satisfaction as the ultimate consequence that has intrinsic value. Preference satisfaction is getting what one wants. There is also discussion about the distribution of consequences. Whether it is better that all involved get equal shares or whether it is sufficient if the total good or average good is increased. Act consequentialism specifies that we should do the action that has the best consequences. And rule consequentialism specifies that we should do the action that is an instance of the rule that has the best consequences. All of these issues and others have been discussed in J.J.C. Smart, 1920. And Bernard Williams, 1929–2003, Utilitarianism, For and Against. 1973, and Samuel Scheffler's, 1951, The Rejection of Consequentialism, 1994. There have also been attempts to relate consequentialism to ordinary language philosophy, most notably by R. Hare, 1919–2002.
What was Boyle's method of transdiction?
Boyle, 1627–1691, pointed out that our senses are limited, as shown by findings from telescopes and microscopes. He thought that analogy could be used to extend sense knowledge. Atoms or corpuscles could be understood as analogous to objects we can sense. In this sense, atoms have the same principles of action as objects that can be sensed. Boyle backed up his atomic theory with reports of his own experiments, which, based on the premise that atoms exist, confirmed his predictions about gases, solids, and heat.
What are some of the main themes in philosophy of biology?
Philosophers of biology are interested in how biological explanations differ in form from explanations in the other sciences regarding whether the behavior of living things can be predicted, and in how environment, genetics, and processes of development interact to result in organisms. They are also interested in evolutionary theory. Useful texts in philosophy of biology include Alexander Rosenberg, Structure of Biological Science. 1985, Elliot Sober, The Nature of Selection, 1984, and Michael Ruse, Philosophy of Biology, 1973. Most contemporary philosophers of biology rely on Ernst Mayer's The Growth of Biological Thought. Diversity, Evolution, and Inheritance. 1982, and Towards a New Philosophy of Biology, Observations of an Evolutionist, 1988. Additional thought by biologists have also resulted in new perspectives on biology that include work by Patrick Bateson, Richard Dawkins, Jared Diamond, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, John Maynard Smith, and Edward O. Wilson. Also, evolutionary biology has inspired new philosophical systems of thought, for example, by Daniel Dennett.
What is Confucianism?
Confucius, 551–479 B. CE, was born in Shantung, China, where he advanced from poverty to an influential administrative post. He was a member of the Zhu. The literal meaning of Zhu is weaklings, a social group of ritualists and teachers. Confucius and his colleagues and followers became members of the Zhu Qia, the school of the Zhu. They sought to develop and restore traditional ideals of concern for all living things and reverence toward other human beings by determining and following proper rules of conduct. In 496 Confucius left his position to talk to rulers about the Zhu Qia's doctrines. During a time when warlords were chaotically vying for control of the declining Zhou dynasty, he sought to import moral principles and the traditional virtues into government. Confucius' thoughts were put together by his pupils in the Lunyu, or Analects.
What was interesting about Voltaire's life?
Voltaire, 1694–1778, led a very dramatic life. After his classical education at a Jesuit school, he chose literature over law, and his subsequent satires resulted in his banishment from Paris as well as exile to Holland. He spent almost a year imprisoned in the Bastille. All of this happened by the time he was 24. Voltaire was believed to be the best playwright in France for half a century. A disagreement with a chevalier resulted in another sojourn in the Bastille, after which he went to England and learned the language, philosophy, and politics of that country. In 1734 he had to flee Paris again, and for the next 15 years he studied physics, metaphysics, and history with the highly intelligent Marquise du Châtelet, in Lorraine. During this time he was also at court, protected by Madame de Pompadour, who was the mistress of King Louis XV. Voltaire became historiographer of France and a member of the French Academy in 1746. In 1750 he was appointed philosopher-poet to Frederick the Great of Prussia, but they had disagreements after 3 years. Voltaire then bought a chateau in Geneva, Switzerland, and then an estate in France. In France he defended Jean Calas, a Protestant who in 1762 was tortured on the rack and executed. Voltaire was by then very rich and he devoted himself to causes against the oppression of the Church. When he returned to Paris at age 83, he was highly acclaimed, but died soon afterwards. He was first buried outside Paris, but then his remains were moved to the Pantheon, only to be again disinterred during the Restoration. Voltaire's body was never completely reassembled after that.
How did Michel Foucault's philosophy develop?
Foucault went back to René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. To show that the designation of insanity was the product of an age that valued reason in a certain form. He thought that medical practice in general required a certain kind of seeing before specific pathologies could be detected. In The Order of Things, 1966, he argued that part of the development of economics, science, and linguistics in the 18th and 19th centuries entailed the invention of the idea of man as a universal subject. Man, the universal subject, was supposed to be always the same and always rational. In The Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, Foucault showed how the sciences themselves are constituted by discourses, or background ways of forming and transmitting knowledge, without prior standards that make scientific knowledge acceptable as knowledge. Scientific discoveries would have no importance. For example, if we hear that scientists have discovered a gene that predisposes people to a certain kind of cancer, we accept this as true, because we accept the authority of science. Discipline and Punish, The Origin of the Prison, 1975. Marks the beginning of Foucault's investigation of power. He argued that institutions such as the prison, the army, the factory, and the school wield power through specific techniques in which oppression can coexist with representative democratic political structures.
What is fideism and what does it have to do with what Montaigne demonstrated about skepticism?
Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, demonstrated how skepticism could be a double-edged sword. It could be used to reject irrational claims, and it could be used to attack the certainty of any body of knowledge, including scientific knowledge based on the senses and the conclusions of logical reasoning. This made skepticism extremely useful for Catholic theologians attacking the claims of Protestants, and vice versa. Today, we think of skeptics as those who require careful scientific evidence for claims and judgments. Usually a skeptic is someone who will not take anything on faith. But Montaigne showed that even the best evidence, including sensory information, can be doubted, so that for him, the skeptic is someone who is better off relying on faith. What Montaigne had in mind was not only faith about knowledge that could not be proved to a certainty, but a life of faith in which all attempts at rigorous knowledge were avoided. This is known as fideism.
What does Afrocentrism have to do with philosophy?
African philosophy is of interest to philosophers as a theoretical system of thought. Also, some philosophers have accepted the challenge raised by Afrocentrism, that Western philosophy has excluded the intellectual perspectives of Africans.
What is the story of Descartes' life?
René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, father was a member of the minor nobility. His mother died when he was 13 months old. And after his father remarried, he was raised by his maternal grandmother. At 10 he was sent to the new Jesuit college of La Flèche in Anjou, France, and there studied the classics, history, rhetoric, and Aristotelian natural philosophy. Although he considered La Flèche an excellent school, he thought that the natural philosophy he learned there was doubtful, mainly because it was based on scholastic abstractions that had been outdated by more recent discoveries and thought. Descartes then took a law degree at Poitiers and set off to complete his education by travel in Europe. He wrote that he had resolved to seek no knowledge other than that which could be found either in myself or the great book of the world. He served briefly in the army and then became friends with Isaac Beeckman. 1588 to 1637, a Dutch philosopher and scientist who inspired him to study mathematics. Descartes' first book, Compendium Musicae, applied mathematics to harmony and dissonance. Descartes also began work on his discovery of analytic geometry that was published in 1637.
How did George Santayana spend his last years?
The outbreak of World War II, Santayana found himself in Rome. He was unable to access his U.S. bank accounts and so took very modest accommodations in the Clinica della Piccola Compagnia di Maria, Clinic of the Little Company of Mary. This clinic was run by an order that, because of the color of their habits, were known as the Blue Nuns. Santayana ended up spending 13 years there, until he died. Originally, he stayed on because he liked the safety of the convent as a refuge from the war. But in time he came to appreciate its old-fashioned ways away from the hustle and bustle of modern life, for their own sake.
What were W. V. O. Quine's most influential ideas?
Quine did not think that the analytic-synthetic distinction could be defended, because he did not think that analytic could be defined in a non-circular way. He had a holistic view of knowledge, likening the whole of all of our theories to a web. He believed that assertions of existence were relative to specific theories. And he thought that philosophical epistemology should be naturalized. By this he meant that philosophical epistemology should be consistent with standards for scientific truth.
What was Enlightenment philosophy?
Enlightenment philosophy was written during the time associated with the Enlightenment, which occurred roughly around the 18th century. The Enlightenment was an historical period in which the ideas of philosophers played dominant cultural roles. In contrast to the importance of religion during the medieval period, or the importance of science and technology in the 19th and 20th centuries.
What reforms did Cesare Beccaria advocate?
Cesare Beccaria, 1738–1794, wrote on Crimes and Punishments, 1764, which was influential against the idea that punishment serves retribution. He reasoned that the purpose of imprisonment was the protection of society and the reform of criminals. Beccaria's book is believed to have been influential in the abolition of torture and maiming as routine criminal punishments by the mid-19th century.
Did Aristotle think that morality had a purpose or final cause?
Yes. Aristotle thought that in human life as in nature, generally everything has a purpose and there cannot be an infinite regress of purposes. That is, there is an unmoved mover, because we are goal-directed. There must be some goal that is valuable to us in itself, and not because it will lead to some other goal. The goal that is good in and of itself is happiness. Aristotle thought that happiness is not pleasure or any other feeling, but a quality that settles over life when we are actualizing our essence by behaving virtuously for the right reasons. Our essence is our rationality.
What is philosophy for children?
Philosophy for children is an attempt both to introduce critical thinking and the subject of philosophy to high school students and to explore and develop natural interest in philosophical questions among younger children. In Europe, high school age students have traditionally had at least some philosophy on their curricula. The question in the United States is not whether teenagers are capable of learning philosophy, but how to introduce it and find teachers qualified to do so, as well as funding. While psychologist Jean Piaget set the paradigm that children are not able to think about thinking or engage in philosophy before about age 12, philosopher Gareth Matthews, 1929, argues in Philosophy and the Young Child, 1980, that there was evidence of philosophical thought and speech in Piaget's own young subjects. Before then, Matthew Lipman, 1922, had introduced philosophy to middle school children in Montclair, New Jersey, with his 96-page philosophical novel for children, Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery, 1974. A philosophical novel for children is a story that raises philosophical issues in language that a child can understand. Both Matthews and Lipman have stressed the active nature of children's philosophical interests. By contrast, Norwegian author Jostein Gaarder's best-selling young adult novel Sophie's World, a novel about the history of philosophy, 1994, leads the reader through a series of studies about philosophy. Thus, philosophy for teenagers may be more didactic than the philosophy already taught to children. Contemporary journals devoted to teaching children philosophy include Analytic Teaching, the Community of Inquiry Journal, Critical and Creative Thinking, the Australasian Journal of Philosophy for Children. Questions, Philosophy for Young People, and Thinking, the Journal of Philosophy for Children.
What were Wollstonecraft's theoretical innovations?
Mary Wollstonecraft developed the arguments of the 17th-century anonymous writer who said in an essay in defense of the female sex, the usurpation of man, and the tyranny of custom, here in England. Especially, that women had the traits they did because of the roles society assigned them. However, Wollstonecraft stopped short of condemning men for this or claiming that women were superior or equal to men in character or strength. Wollstonecraft's general contribution to political and social theory was twofold. First, in the case of women, she offered a detailed analysis of how their customary upbringing and assigned roles in society caused them to develop those traits that were considered natural to the female sex: emotionality, submissiveness, impulsiveness, vanity. Second, she pursued the assumption that reason could be used to improve human happiness. In both of her major works, she assumed that it was the obligation of rational people of both sexes to endorse social progress and human equality. Wollstonecraft's progressiveness was focused on the life conditions of those who were disadvantaged and oppressed, which was not the case with leading male political philosophers in the 17th century, or even during the Enlightenment. In that sense, she was a revolutionary thinker.